Hi, Brian here from Anything About Guns Sans the Idiots, and I'm here today to go over several part video series with you on the topic of reloading. The purpose of this video series is to give you a comprehensive look at reloading in virtually every aspect of it, going from start to finish. This will be from someone who's never reloaded before, all the way up to someone who's been doing it for years, and most of what I cover will be review, but you might pick up a few tips and tricks along the way that help to make things easier or faster for you. First, just a little disclaimer, I am not a professional reloader. This is not what I do for a living, and anything that I do in this video, any advice that I give, you are taking responsibility for your own actions. The biggest thing with reloading is common sense, which brings us into my first topic, which is that of safety. First of all, obviously, reloading can be somewhat dangerous. We're dealing with ammunition, not just live ammunition, but ammunition in its various stages of becoming loaded, and we are working with explosive materials, and obviously there's a level of safety that we need to be aware of here. One thing that we want to do is always be careful when we're working with powder or primers. That's the first thing that we want to talk about with safety, is just, powder is explosive and so are primers. So obviously no flame or spark or anything around those materials. Another thing that we want to do is, when we're weighing out our powder, we want to make sure that we're weighing the correct amount of powder. In addition to that, we want to make sure that we're not double throwing powder. And what I mean by that is, if you're using a powder measure, you have the possibility of, if you're not paying attention, throwing one measure of powder and then getting distracted by something and accidentally throwing a second load of powder into the same case, in which case that thing is going to explode when you shoot it. Next is, if you choose to, wear gloves and eye protection. That is, again, we're working with some hazardous materials here. Things can go wrong, so take caution there. Refer to loading manuals. The guys that you're going to see online with load data, you have to be a bit cautious there. Mistakes can be made. There's a lot of different calibers that are very similar. For example, just on my site the other day, someone was talking about a 7mm .08 cartridge, and someone else thought they were talking about 7mm mag. If you tried to put the powder charge of 7mm mag in a 7mm .08, you're going to have trouble. Also, you never really know who it is you're getting load data from online. So if you choose to get your load data online, try to verify that from several sources. Or an even better option is to refer to an official load manual, such as a Speer, Barnes, Hornaday, some sort of reloading manual. In regards to that load data, you always want to start with at least a 10% decrease in your powder charge to start off with. So say you're loading 308 and you're using Varget powder, and it says 46 grains of Varget is the max. You would want to use 4.6 grains less than that to start off with. Load that, make sure that it's safe, make sure you're not getting any damaged brass when you shoot that load, and you can work up from there to the maximum if you're not noticing any case damage. Which brings me to inspecting brass. Brass casings wear out, they get damaged. Sometimes when you eject a shell, they get damaged. If you had a particularly hot load, they can be damaged. So whenever you reload, you want to inspect that brass. You want to check the case mouth, make sure that there's no cracking or splitting. You want to check for any bulges, and also make sure you're loading the correct brass, because sometimes similar brass gets mixed together. For example, 9mm and 380 ACP can get mixed together and you won't notice it. Or sometimes 40 and 45 will get mixed together. So just be careful you're loading the correct brass. Alright, again, on that same track with using the correct stuff, also make sure you're using the right powder. The same powder charge is not a constant across all the different kinds of powders. For example, using the same 308 cartridge I was using before, if I was to go ahead and load that with IMR, the amount of powder that I'm going to use is going to be different than if I use Varget. And then lastly here, when you're working with a reloading press, this is a reloading press, this happens to be a Dillon 550B, you never want to force this handle. This is the handle that you're going to use to size the cases, deprime the cases, seat the bullets, do all sorts of crimping, and you should never have to force this handle. So don't do it. If it seems like you have to push unusually hard, take a step back, take a look, see what's going on. Next I want to talk about what kinds of ammunition can actually be reloaded, because one thing you must know is that not all kinds of ammunition can be reloaded. Generally, when we're talking about reloading, we're talking about reloading ammunition that has either brass or nickel-plated casings. And we're talking about ammunition that would be using center fire boxer primers. So that excludes any rimfire cartridges such as 22 long rifle or 17 HMR or any of the other rimfire cartridges. And it also generally excludes burden primed casings. From what I understand, technically you can reload those, but it's a huge pain and something I won't be covering and something most people don't do. Also, when we're talking about military brass, that kind of primer is actually crimped into place, but that can be addressed. You can reload military brass without too much trouble with either a swager or a reamer, and that's something that we're going to be discussing later on. The next thing I'm going to discuss, which I think is critically important to understanding reloading, is taking a closer look at the components that make up a loaded round of ammunition. Basically, there's 4 components. You have a brass casing, a bullet, a primer, and then some sort of powder. First thing we're going to look at here is the brass casing. This happens to be a 308 casing, and I'm going to go over a little bit about some of the parts of this. Looking at it from the top here, this opening is called the case mouth, and that's actually where the bullet is going to be seated. Looking at it from the side here, there is a flat portion near the top of the casing, and that's called the neck of the case. Going down from there, you see this little step here, and that's called the shoulder. Looking at the bottom, this whole bottom portion of the case here is called the case head. And at the center of the bottom of that is the primer pocket. And now this one already has a primer in it. Let me show you. This is one without a primer seated in it. This is a 223 casing. And you can see the opening at the bottom here is where the primer gets seated. And I'm not sure how well it shows up, but if you look through there, there's actually a hole, and that is called the flash hole. And that's where the explosion from the primer reaches the powder, which is in the rest of the case. Still talking about brass here, we actually have a couple of different kinds of brass. One of the ways you can identify brass is by the type of rim that it has. Most kinds of brass, the far more prevalent in modern times here is rimless casings. And that basically refers to the rim as the bottom here, and on rimless case designs, the rim is basically flush with the side of the casing, which is in contrast to a rimmed cartridge. Unfortunately, I don't actually shoot any rimmed ammunition, any rimmed centerfire ammunition anyway, except for 7.62x54R, which is generally used in Mosin Nagants, and that's, you know, the military surplus ammo is so cheap I don't even bother reloading it. But I do have a 22 long rifle here, and you can see there's sort of a step at the bottom there, and that is what a rimmed casing will look like. And as I discussed, you cannot reload 22 long rifle, but that's just what a rimmed casing looks like. And then there's various kinds of straight-walled brass or casings. This happens to be a 9mm, but a lot of handgun ammunition and some rifle ammunition use straight-walled casings, and that will come into play when you're talking about head spacing a rifle, which I'm not going to go into in this reloading video series. The next component we have in reloading is the bullet. And contrary to what you will hear a lot of times, this is a bullet. This is a loaded round of ammunition. So don't confuse the two and sound like an idiot. This is a bullet. Anyway, when we're talking about bullets, there are lots of different kinds. They vary in all sorts of different ways. There are several different styles of bullet. For example, two that I have here. This is a hollow point. This is actually a Nosler Custom Competition match hollow point. You can see, hopefully you can see it there. There's a slight hole in the end of there, and that is what designates it as a hollow point. There are lots of hollow points that are far more open than that. A lot of the handgun bullets are going to be much more open than that, and when you're talking about a match bullet, somehow, you know, there's some crazy physics at work there, but that actually helps the bullet in flight a little bit. And then when you're talking about other kinds of ammunition, that hollow point actually is what helps cause the bullet to expand and open up a wound channel and do a little bit more damage. This is an example of a ballistic tip. It has this polymer or plastic tip on the end here, and these actually perform very similar to hollow points. Basically, that tip disintegrates on impact and allows the bullet to mushroom. But beyond just those two examples, there's other kinds of bullets as well. There's soft points, there's armor piercing, there's incendiary. There's a whole wide range of different kinds of bullets. In addition to the kind of bullet will also be the bullet weight. And that bullet weight is going to come into play when you're talking about the twist of your barrel. I was actually just discussing this on my gun page earlier today, and talking about barrel twist. And the barrel twist is usually expressed as a ratio, such as 1 to 9 or 1 in 9. And basically it's an expression of how fast or slow that bullet is going to be spinning. For example, if you have a 1 in 9 twist, that means that the bullet is going to spin in the barrel 1 time every 9 inches. So a 1-9 twist is slower than a 1-7 twist, which would mean that the bullet would spin around 1 time in 7 inches in the barrel. And generally speaking, that barrel twist is going to give you a range of bullet weights that are going to be suitable in your specific barrel The faster twists are going to stabilize heavier bullets, and the slower twists are going to be better for lighter bullets. And you're just going to have to, look up online or in some book somewhere for your specific caliber, see, what barrel twists are good for what range of bullet weights, and make your determination from there. After the bullet, the next thing we have is the primer. This is a primer, and generally you don't want to handle these with your hands, but for the purpose of this video I'm going to. And this happens to be a small rifle primer. And this is also what's called a boxer primer. And this is going to be the style of primer that we're going to be using during reloading, as opposed to the Berdan primers, which I discussed earlier. And basically, we have a couple different sizes here. As I said, this is a small rifle primer. Let me grab my 308 case here. And in the 308 case, that is a large rifle primer. And those are the two sizes or diameters of primer. So you have to make sure that you use the correct size. In addition to the size, there's also pistol or rifle primers. So there will be another primer that looks just like this, but is going to be for pistols. And those are going to use a different type of impact sensitive explosive, and you need to make sure that you grab the correct one. In addition to that, there is also magnum primers, which are going to, again, have a different type of explosive in them or in a different amount, and you want to make sure you use the correct type, either magnum or not. If you try to use a magnum primer in, say, a 45 ACP, which would use a standard primer, you're going to have issues there. So make sure it's either rifle or pistol, and then magnum or non, and then also the correct size. After that, we have various different kinds of powder. I have several examples here. First thing we have to know up front is that there's actually two different kinds of powder. There's smokeless powder, which is what we're going to be discussing and what we're going to use for all our reloading, or black powder, which is a more ancient form of powder that's still used today in muzzle loaders and black powder rifles, but all center fire rounds that are going to be using a brass casing are going to be using smokeless powder, so make sure you use the right kind. As far as types of smokeless powder, there's several different kinds. I have examples of 3 of the most common. The first one that I have here is IMR 3031, and this is an extruded powder. I don't know if you can see it there, but it looks like little rods or grains of rice, and that is an excellent kind of powder for precision rifle reloading. One of the things it does really well is resist temperature shifts. One thing you'll learn if you shoot a lot, especially in different temperatures, is that ammunition will have a different point of impact in different temperatures. So, the classic example of this is the guy who does his rifle sighting for deer hunting in the middle of summer, and then he goes out deer hunting 6 months later, and it's 10 degrees out, and things shooting way off, and obviously that's going to be an example of temperature shift. The extruded powder is better at resisting that change. It's still going to have some, just not as much. The next thing I have here is actually Accurate 2230, and this is a ball powder. I'm not sure, might be really hard to see, but this is just basically tiny little balls. And then the last kind here is unique powder. It's actually called unique. It's not a unique powder. It's called unique, and it's flake powder. So it's just basically little flakes, And this particular powder, I'm sure I'll catch some grief for it because it's a very dirty powder. But I like it because you can use it in a lot of different ammunition. I can use it anywhere from my 380 ACP all the way through 45 ACP. I can use that same powder, obviously with different amounts of it. But those are the 4 components of ammunition which lead up to the finished product. The next thing I think that is important to understand when you're talking about reloading, or actually just a general knowledge to have if you shoot firearms, is to have some basic understanding of what is actually occurring when you're shooting a round of ammunition. And I'm not going to go into the mechanisms inside of a firearm. That's really beyond the scope of this video. But in all cases, you're going to have a firing pin contacting a primer. It's even true in rimfire cases. The firing pin is just going to contact the rim of that case, which is where the primer basically is in that case. But in all cases, you're going to have a firing pin, and it's going to slam into the primer, causing a dent to form in that primer. And what's inside that primer is an impact sensitive explosive. So when that primer, or when that firing pin, hits the primer, that is going to set off an explosion in the primer. That then is going to be transferred through that flash hole that I pointed out earlier into the rest of the casing, which is where the powder is. So the explosion from that primer is going to travel through the flash hole, and it's going to ignite the powder. And the powder is going to undergo deflagration, which is actually, it's basically a slow explosion. It might be kind of difficult to imagine because, when you squeeze off a round, it seems to happen very quickly. But that powder burns actually fairly slow in terms of an explosion, and what happens is that powder burning causes a massive buildup of pressure inside that case. And what I mean by massive is massive. We're talking on the low end from 30,000 psi all the way up to 70,000 psi, depending on the caliber and the powder charge that you're using. But we're talking about a massive amount of pressure, and what that pressure is going to do is basically force the bullet out of the case mouth and into the barrel, where it is going to travel down the barrel and be discharged from the muzzle. But that is just gives you a basic idea of what happens when you actually fire a round of ammunition. The last thing I want to cover in this introduction video is just to go over a brief outline as to the steps that you're going to take in reloading ammunition. And basically the reason for that is because in talking to a lot of people about reloading, people who've never reloaded before, there just seems to be a general confusion when it comes to reloading, and they just have basically no idea where to even begin. And so what you have to understand about these steps is that these can be altered. Everyone kind of develops their own rhythm for reloading. Some of these steps, you can switch them around. You can do one before another. Some of them can be omitted entirely depending on what kind of reloading you're doing. And there actually might be some steps you might need to add depending on, how you're going to be cleaning your brass, if you're going to be reloading rifle versus pistol, etc. But this will just kind of give you a real basic idea of what the steps are, what you're going to have to do. The first thing that's pretty much common to all of reloading is that you're going to have to clean the brass. Generally speaking, when you're talking about reloading, you're going to be using brass that's already been fired before. I personally buy pretty much exclusively once fired brass, meaning brass from people who don't reload, and they sell it to me or give it to me. It's basically been fired one time and I get it. That's in contrast to buying new brass, which you can do. You can buy brand new brass that's never been loaded before, but it's much more expensive, and I don't really see the benefit to it except for saving a little bit of time. So you're going to have to clean the brass, which we're going to go into that in more detail later. That's the first step, which is generally going to involve a tumbler of some sort. This is a Frankfurt Arsenal tumbler, and it's going to use some sort of media in it, be it crushed walnut, corn cob, or some stainless steel media of some kind. But after the brass has been cleaned in there, the next step is to separate the brass from the cleaning media. And there's several ways to do that. The easiest is going to be using a media separator, which I will show you later on. After you have separated the brass out from the media, you're going to want to inspect it. Again, I keep harping on that. That is hugely important. If you are not paying attention and you load a round with a bad brass, a cracked or bulged or whatever, that is going to cause some major problems for you. After you've inspected that brass, you make sure it's all good and ready to load. You want to lubricate that. Again, this is one of those steps that might possibly be omitted. I'm going to go over in the equipment section a little bit more about this, but if you're reloading rifle casings with that shoulder in them, that is always going to need to be lubricated. Pistol brass or some other straight-walled casings sometimes may not have to be lubricated depending on what kind of dies you're using. If you're using carbide dies, you may be able to avoid that step. But you're going to lubricate the brass for the next step, which is going to be the sizing and depriming. And basically in that step you're going to be using a sizing and depriming die, which is going to basically force that casing back into its original shape. And it's also going to remove the spent primer if there is one in there, which there normally will be. The next step, if you're using military brass, is going to be to swage or ream that crimp in the primer pocket. There's a little bit of excess metal there, and it's either going to be difficult or impossible to seat a new primer without removing that crimp, and that's going to be the next step. After that is deburring the flash hole, and I almost hesitate to even mention it because it's a step that you're only going to do in match ammunition, match rifle ammunition, if you're trying to achieve the absolute best groups possible. There's actually a lot of debate about this as far as whether it's even necessary, whether it does anything. But basically, the idea is that with factory brass, the flash hole is just basically stamped with a pin, and so that flash hole can be rough or slightly out around, and deburring that flash hole will take care of that. And that's something that only has to be done one time, and for the life of that brass casing, you don't ever need to do that again. The next step is going to be to trim the cases to length. Again, this is a step that you may be able to skip. Pistol brass, I generally don't ever worry about sizing it to length. Rifle brass, generally speaking, I will size that, or I will trim that to length the first time I use it, and then I will trim it to length whenever it starts getting out of spec, or maybe every 4 to 5 reloads I'll make sure to trim it to length again. And again, that's going to vary depending on the level of accuracy you want to achieve. But besides just accuracy, you also need to make sure that the brass is trimmed to within SAMI specifications. If it's too long, it's not going to chamber properly. The next step after trimming is going to be deburring and chamfering the case mouth. When you trim the brass, you're basically using a cutter to kind of trim it back to the proper length. And there's going to be a burr left on the brass casing from that process. And the next step then would be to remove that burr. After that, you're going to possibly tumble the brass again. And the purpose of that is to remove the lubrication that you use during the sizing step. And also, depending on the order that you went in, you may have had a spent primer in your brass the first time you tumbled it. And this will also serve to help clean that primer pocket out. After that, we are going to prime the brass. Basically pretty straightforward. It's just you use some sort of priming tool. I'll go into those later. You're going to use some sort of priming tool to prime the brass. After that is when you're going to do probably one of the most critical steps, which is measuring the powder. And I say critical because not only will the amount of powder drastically affect your point of impact, but also making an error in this area is the #1 reason why people have unsafe ammunition. If you use the wrong powder charge, either you're going to end up with a round that's stuck in the barrel if you didn't use enough, in which case a lot of people, you know, they're like, oh, what just happened? And they'll squeeze off another one. And either that one blows it up in your face, or you're still wondering what's going on and you squeeze off another one. In which case you're almost definitely going to have that barrel blow up at you. And that's, you know, going to make for a pretty crappy day. Or, on the other side of the spectrum, if you load too much powder, the thing can just blow up right in front of you. You can find pictures all over the internet of people that have loaded too much powder. So be careful about that. And then the next step after measuring out the correct amount of powder is you're going to insert the bullet into the casing. And that's just basically using a bullet seating die. We'll go over that in detail later. And basically after you've seated that bullet, another step is possibly adding a crimp. Sometimes the bullet seating die has the ability to crimp the brass within it, depending on how far down you seat the die. You can set a crimp, or you might be using a separate factory crimp die. It's generally what I prefer. Or in some cases you don't even need to crimp at all. After that, you have a loaded round of ammunition. It's done. But you're still not done. You still have to go through and inspect them all. Look at each one carefully. Make sure you haven't made any mistakes that are obvious. And after that, go out and shoot.